The rain fell steadily on the cobblestone streets of Westminster as Marcus Wellington adjusted his red, ceremonial uniform for the final time that evening. 23 years he had served as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, and in all those years, he had never imagined that his biggest threat would come not from a foreign enemy or an angry protester, but from someone wearing the same type of badge he once proudly carried. Marcus had always been different from the other guards. While most of his colleagues came from military backgrounds, Marcus had spent 8 years as a police officer before joining the Royal Guard. His transition from the Metropolitan Police to Royal Service had been smooth, and his experience in law enforcement had made him one of the most respected guards in the unit. His colleagues often sought his advice on handling difficult situations, and the senior officers trusted him with the most sensitive assignments. The evening of November 15th started like any other. Marcus had completed his shift at the palace and was walking toward the underground station when he noticed the commotion ahead. A small crowd had gathered around two figures near a bus stop, and the familiar sound of raised voices suggested trouble was brewing. His training kicked in automatically, and despite being off duty, Marcus found himself walking toward the scene. As he got closer, he could see a young woman, probably in her early 20s, backing away from a man who appeared to be intoxicated. The man was swaying slightly and gesturing aggressively while the woman clutched her purse tightly and tried to create distance between them. Several pedestrians had stopped to watch, but no one was intervening. Marcus approached carefully, his years of police training guiding his actions. He positioned himself where he could see both individuals clearly and assess the situation quickly. The man appeared to be demanding something from the woman, though his slurred speech made it difficult to understand exactly what he wanted. The woman looked frightened and was repeatedly saying no while trying to back away. Drawing on his police experience, Marcus stepped forward and spoke in a calm but authoritative voice. He identified himself as a royal guard and asked the man to step back and explain what was happening. The intoxicated man turned toward Marcus with obvious annoyance, clearly irritated by the interruption. He mumbled something about the woman owing him money and insisted that Marcus mind his own business. The woman looked relieved to see someone in uniform and quickly explained that the man had been following her from the pub where she worked as a waitress. She said he had been drinking heavily all evening and had become increasingly aggressive when she refused to give him her phone number. When she left work, he had followed her and was now demanding she go with him to another pub. Marcus could see that the situation was escalating and needed to be resolved quickly before it got out of hand. He used the de-escalation techniques he had learned during his police training, speaking calmly to the intoxicated man and trying to reason with him. He explained that the woman had the right to refuse his advances and suggested that he head home to sleep off the alcohol. For a moment, it seemed like the approach might work. The man appeared to be listening and even nodded a few times. However, when Marcus suggested he call a taxi for him, the man suddenly became belligerent again. He accused Marcus of trying to steal the woman from him and began shouting obscenities. The crowd that had gathered was growing larger, and Marcus knew he needed to resolve the situation quickly. He positioned himself between the man and the woman, creating a protective barrier while continuing to speak in calm, measured tones. He had handled hundreds of similar situations during his police career and felt confident he could manage this one as well. What Marcus did not notice was the unmarked police car that had pulled up at the end of the street. Two plainclothes officers had received a call about a disturbance and had arrived to investigate. From their position, they could see a man in what appeared to be a military uniform confronting a civilian, but they could not hear the conversation clearly due to the distance and street noise. Detective Inspector Richard Hayes was a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police who prided himself on his quick response times and decisive action. His partner, Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, was newer to plainclothes work, but had shown promising instincts during her first year in the unit. Both officers had been having a particularly stressful week, dealing with several high-profile cases and working long hours. As they observed the scene from their car, Hayes made a quick assessment based on what he could see. A man in military dress was standing over what appeared to be a frightened woman, while an agitated civilian was nearby. Without taking the time to fully assess the situation or call for uniform backup, Hayes decided to intervene immediately. The two detectives approached the group quickly, with Hayes taking the lead. His years of experience had taught him to project authority from the moment he arrived at a scene, and he immediately began issuing commands without first determining exactly what was happening. Marcus heard someone shouting behind him and turned to see two individuals approaching rapidly. In the dim streetlight, and with the rain creating poor visibility, he could not immediately identify them as police officers. His first thought was that these might be associates of the intoxicated man who had arrived to cause more trouble. The situation deteriorated rapidly from that point. Hayes, assuming that Marcus was the aggressor in the situation, ordered him to step away from the woman immediately. Marcus, confused by the sudden appearance of these two individuals and not recognizing them as police officers, attempted to explain that he was trying to help the woman and that he was a royal guard. Hayes interpreted Marcus's attempt to explain as resistance and non-compliance with his lawful orders. He moved closer to Marcus and repeated his commands more forcefully, while reaching for his radio to call for backup. The stress of the week, combined with his assumption about what was happening, caused Hayes to react more aggressively than the situation warranted. Marcus, still not realizing he was dealing with police officers, continued to try to explain the situation. He showed his identification as a royal guard and attempted to describe what had been happening when he arrived. However, the noise from the crowd and the rain made clear communication difficult, and both men were becoming increasingly frustrated. The young woman, who had been silent during this exchange, tried to interject and explain that Marcus had been helping her. However, in the confusion and with multiple people talking at once, her voice was not heard clearly by the officers. The intoxicated man, seeing an opportunity to escape the situation, began to quietly move away from the scene. Detective Sergeant Mitchell, following her partner's lead and trusting his assessment of the situation, moved to support Hayes. She positioned herself to Marcus's side, ready to assist if the situation escalated further. Her training told her to trust her senior partner's judgment, even though something about the scene did not feel quite right to her. The critical moment came when Hayes, frustrated by what he perceived as Marcus's continued resistance, decided to take physical control of the situation. He reached out to grab Marcus's arm, intending to restrain him while they sorted out what was happening. Marcus, still not understanding that these were police officers and feeling threatened by the aggressive approach, instinctively pulled his arm away. This natural defensive reaction was exactly what Hayes had been expecting from what he believed was a non-compliant suspect. In his mind, it confirmed his assessment that Marcus was indeed causing trouble and needed to be subdued. Without hesitation, Hayes escalated his use of force, grabbing Marcus more forcefully and attempting to push him against a nearby wall. The crowd that had gathered gasped as they watched what appeared to be a police officer assaulting someone in military uniform. Several people began shouting, some telling Hayes to stop, and others trying to explain that Marcus had been helping the woman. The noise and confusion only added to the chaos of the situation. Marcus, trained in defensive tactics from both his police and Royal Guard experience, instinctively resisted being pushed against the wall. This was not a conscious decision to fight the officers, but rather an automatic response based on years of training. However, Hayes interpreted this resistance as an attack on a police officer. What happened next would change both men's lives forever. Hayes, believing he was under attack, struck Marcus with a closed fist, catching him off guard and causing him to stumble backward. The blow was delivered with significant force, and Marcus lost his balance on the wet pavement. The sound of Marcus hitting the ground seemed to echo through the street despite the rain and traffic noise. The crowd fell silent for a moment as they processed what they had just witnessed. A decorated royal guard, someone who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting others, lay on the wet pavement while a police officer stood over him. It was at that moment that Detective Sergeant Mitchell finally managed to get close enough to examine Marcus's identification properly. Her face went pale as she read the credentials that clearly identified him as a serving member of the Royal Guard. She immediately called out to her partner, but the damage had already been done. Hayes looked down at the identification card in Mitchell's hands, and the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This was not a troublemaker or a criminal they had just subdued. This was a fellow law enforcement officer who had been trying to help someone in distress. The weight of his mistake hit him like a physical blow. The young woman, no longer afraid to speak up, rushed forward to help Marcus while loudly explaining to anyone who would listen that he had been protecting her from the drunk man. She pointed to where the intoxicated individual had been standing, but he had long since disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the consequences of the misunderstanding. Marcus slowly got to his feet with help from the woman and a few concerned bystanders. His uniform was dirty and torn, and he could feel blood trickling from a cut on his lip. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the humiliation and confusion he felt. In all his years of service, both as a police officer and as a Royal Guard, he had never been treated this way by a fellow officer. The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people had captured portions of the incident on their mobile phones. In the age of social media, news traveled fast, and by the time Marcus made it home that night, videos of the incident were already beginning to appear online. Detective Inspector Hayes stood in the rain, watching Marcus walk away, knowing that his career and reputation had just taken a potentially fatal blow. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a crushing burden, and he could already imagine the investigations, hearings, and consequences that would follow. As the street returned to its normal rhythm, with cars passing by and pedestrians going about their business, the implications of those few minutes were only beginning to unfold. Two careers hung in the balance. Public trust in law enforcement would be questioned once again, and the media would soon have a new story to dissect and analyze. Neither Marcus nor Hayes could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change, or how this single incident would spark conversations about police accountability, proper identification procedures, and the importance of taking time to assess a situation before acting. The ripple effects of that rainy November evening would extend far beyond the two men involved, touching the lives of their families, colleagues, and the communities they served. The stage was set for a story that would capture public attention and force difficult questions about authority, responsibility, and the thin blue line that sometimes becomes a barrier instead of a bridge between those who serve and those they are sworn to protect. The smartphone footage began appearing on social media platforms within hours of the incident. The first video, captured by a university student who had been walking home from the library, showed the final moments of the confrontation in grainy but unmistakable detail. The image of a police officer striking someone in Royal Guard uniform spread across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram like wildfire. By morning, the hashtag Royal Guard Assault was trending nationally, and news outlets were scrambling to identify the individuals involved and piece together the full story. The initial video clips, taken from different angles by various witnesses, painted a damning picture of police brutality against a member of one of Britain's most respected institutions. Marcus Wellington woke up that Saturday morning to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. His phone had been buzzing incessantly since 5 in the morning, but exhaustion from the previous night's events had kept him sleeping deeply. When he finally checked his messages, he found frantic texts from colleagues, friends, and even distant relatives who had seen the videos online. His commanding officer, Colonel James Hartwell, had left several voicemails requesting an immediate meeting. The tone in the colonel's voice grew progressively more urgent with each message, making it clear that this situation had already escalated far beyond a simple street altercation. Marcus knew he needed to report to the palace immediately to provide a full account of what had happened. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Richard Hayes was experiencing his own nightmare. He had been called into the station at 6 in the morning by his superintendent, who had been contacted by the commissioner himself. The video footage had been forwarded to senior police leadership within hours of appearing online, and questions were being asked at the highest levels of the Metropolitan Police. Hayes sat in the sparse interview room at New Scotland Yard, waiting to give his statement about the incident. His 15 years of service, commendations for bravery, and previously spotless record suddenly felt insignificant compared to those few minutes of footage that showed him striking a royal guard. He had barely slept, replaying the events over and over in his mind, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell was in an adjacent room, providing her own account of the events. As the junior officer present, she faced intense questioning about why she had not intervened when the situation began to escalate. The investigation team wanted to understand whether this was a case of one officer making a mistake or a systemic problem with how the unit operated. The woman Marcus had been protecting, Emma Thornton, had also been contacted by investigators. Her testimony would be crucial in determining exactly what had transpired before the police officers arrived. Emma, a 24-year-old graduate student working part-time as a waitress, found herself thrust into the center of a media storm she never could have imagined. Emma's account was clear and consistent. Marcus had approached the situation professionally, identified himself properly, and had been attempting to de-escalate the confrontation when the plainclothes officers arrived. She emphasized that Marcus had never been aggressive toward her and had, in fact, made her feel safe during a frightening encounter with an intoxicated stranger. The palace response was swift and measured. Colonel Hartwell, after meeting with Marcus and reviewing the available evidence, issued a carefully worded statement expressing confidence in Marcus's character while calling for a thorough investigation into the police response. The statement emphasized the Royal Guard's commitment to serving the public and noted Marcus's exemplary service record. However, behind closed doors, palace officials were deeply concerned about the potential impact on the institution's reputation. The Royal Guard represented centuries of tradition and honor, and any incident that called that reputation into question required careful management. Marcus was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, a standard procedure that nonetheless felt like a punishment to someone who had been trying to help. The media coverage intensified throughout the weekend. News outlets dispatched teams to interview witnesses. Legal experts weighed in on the potential consequences for the officers involved, and social media continued to buzz with outrage and demands for accountability. The incident had struck a nerve with a public already sensitive to issues of police misconduct. Hayes found himself at the center of a storm unlike anything he had experienced in his career. Reporters had somehow obtained his name and were reaching out to neighbors, former colleagues, and even his children's teachers for comments. His family was forced to deal with the sudden attention, and his wife Sarah had to take time off work to manage the situation at home. The internal affairs investigation moved quickly, with senior investigators recognizing the high-profile nature of the case and the need for transparency. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed all available video footage, and conducted detailed background checks on all parties involved. The pressure to get the facts right was enormous, with public trust in the police hanging in the balance. Marcus spent his enforced leave time reflecting on his career and the events that had led to this moment. He had always prided himself on his ability to read situations correctly and respond appropriately, but the incident had shown him how quickly circumstances could spiral out of control. He found himself questioning decisions he had made and wondering if he could have done something differently. The legal implications began to crystallize as the investigation progressed. The Crown Prosecution Service was asked to review the evidence and determine whether criminal charges were appropriate. Civil rights groups called for Hayes to be prosecuted for assault, while police unions argued that he had been acting in good faith based on his assessment of the situation. Public opinion was sharply divided. Many people saw the incident as another example of police overreach and demanded accountability. Others argued that Hayes had been doing his job under difficult circumstances and that mistakes in high-pressure situations were understandable. The debate played out in newspaper editorials, television talk shows, and countless online discussions. Marcus received letters of support from current and former colleagues, many of whom shared their own experiences with misunderstandings and the challenges of maintaining public safety. The Royal Guard community rallied around him, understanding that his reputation and career were at stake despite his years of dedicated service. Hayes, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. While some colleagues expressed private support, the public nature of the incident made it difficult for anyone to defend his actions openly. He began consulting with a solicitor who specialized in police misconduct cases, knowing that his career and freedom might depend on how the legal proceedings unfolded. The investigation revealed additional details that had not been apparent from the initial video footage. Witnesses confirmed that the lighting conditions were poor, that there had been significant background noise, and that the situation had developed rapidly. These factors helped explain, though not necessarily excuse, how Hayes had misassessed what was happening. Security camera footage from nearby businesses provided additional angles of the incident, showing Marcus's attempts to calm the intoxicated man and protect Emma. The footage clearly demonstrated that Marcus had been acting as a good Samaritan rather than as an aggressor, further undermining Hayes's initial assessment of the situation. The psychological toll on both men was significant. Marcus found himself second-guessing every public interaction, wondering if people recognized him from the news coverage. He had always taken pride in his uniform and what it represented, but now he felt self-conscious about the attention it drew. The incident had changed his relationship with the very identity he had built his adult life around. Hayes was struggling with guilt and professional embarrassment. He had always seen himself as one of the good officers, someone who protected the innocent and upheld the law fairly. The realization that he had become the aggressor in a situation where he should have been the protector was eating away at his self-confidence and sense of purpose. The media coverage continued to evolve as new details emerged. Some outlets began to focus on the systemic issues that might have contributed to the incident, examining police training procedures, identification protocols, and the challenges faced by plainclothes officers. Others maintained their focus on individual accountability and the need for consequences. Emma Thornton found herself reluctantly becoming a public figure as reporters sought her perspective on the incident. She struggled with the attention, but felt obligated to speak out in support of Marcus, who had helped her during a frightening encounter. Her interviews provided crucial context that had been missing from the initial video footage. The police union assigned a representative to work with Hayes, understanding that the case had broader implications for officer safety and public perception of law enforcement. They walked a careful line between supporting their member and acknowledging the seriousness of the allegations against him. As the investigation neared completion, both Marcus and Hayes awaited the findings that would determine their futures. The incident had already cost both men their peace of mind and sense of security, regardless of what the official conclusions might be. The ripple effects continued to spread through their respective institutions and communities. The case had become a lightning rod for broader discussions about police reform, accountability, and the relationship between different branches of public service. What had started as a misunderstanding between two dedicated public servants had evolved into a symbol of larger issues facing British society. Senior officials in both the Metropolitan Police and the Royal Guard knew that their response to this incident would be closely watched and would set precedents for how similar situations might be handled in the future. The pressure to balance justice, accountability, and institutional integrity was enormous. As the second week after the incident began, both men prepared for what they knew would be difficult decisions ahead. The investigation was nearly complete, and the findings would soon determine whether this was the end of distinguished careers or the beginning of a long process of rebuilding trust and reputation. The story had captured the public imagination precisely because it involved two institutions that represented the best of British public service. When those institutions appeared to be in conflict with each other, it raised uncomfortable questions about accountability, communication, and the human factor in even the most professional environments. Neither Marcus nor Hayes had set out to become public figures, but their brief encounter on a rainy London street had thrust them into roles they never wanted and sparked conversations that would continue long after their personal situations were resolved. The official investigation report landed on the desks of senior officials 3 weeks after the incident. The document, spanning 47 pages of detailed analysis, witness statements, and expert opinions, painted a complex picture of a situation gone wrong due to a series of unfortunate circumstances and poor decision-making. Chief Inspector Margaret Thompson, who had led the investigation, called a press conference to announce the findings. The packed room included reporters from major news outlets, representatives from police and military organizations, and members of the public who had been following the case closely. The atmosphere was tense as everyone waited to hear whether criminal charges would be recommended. The report found that Detective Inspector Hayes had acted without proper assessment of the situation and had used excessive force against Marcus Wellington. However, it also acknowledged the challenging circumstances, poor visibility, and rapid escalation that had contributed to the misunderstanding. The investigators concluded that while Hayes's actions were inappropriate, they did not rise to the level of criminal assault. Marcus sat in his modest flat in South London, watching the press conference with a mixture of relief and disappointment. While he was vindicated in terms of his own conduct, the decision not to pursue criminal charges against Hayes felt like incomplete justice. The physical altercation had been captured on video for the world to see, yet the officer responsible would face only administrative consequences. Hayes watched the same press conference from the sitting room of his family home, surrounded by his wife and 2 teenage children. The decision brought him immense relief, but he knew his troubles were far from over. The Metropolitan Police had announced that he would face a disciplinary hearing that could result in his dismissal from the force, and the court of public opinion remained largely against him. The disciplinary proceedings were scheduled to begin 6 weeks after the investigation concluded, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Hayes would be represented by a solicitor provided by the police union, while Marcus had been asked to testify about his experience and its impact on his life and career. During this waiting period, both men experienced the incident's lingering effects in different ways. Marcus found that his reputation within the Royal Guard remained strong, but his confidence in public situations had been shaken. He began avoiding off-duty activities that might put him in contact with the police, worried about potential complications or misunderstandings. The palace administration handled Marcus's situation with characteristic discretion and efficiency. Colonel Hartwell arranged for Marcus to meet with a counselor who specialized in helping military personnel deal with traumatic experiences. These sessions helped Marcus process the psychological impact of being attacked by someone he should have been able to trust as a fellow law enforcement professional. Hayes, meanwhile, was struggling with the scrutiny that continued to follow him. Local newspapers had published his photograph alongside articles about police misconduct, and he found it difficult to go anywhere in his neighborhood without being recognized. His children faced uncomfortable questions at school, and his wife had to deal with judgmental comments from other parents. The police union support provided Hayes with legal representation, but it came with conditions. They made it clear that he needed to take responsibility for his mistakes while also defending the broader institution of policing. This balancing act proved challenging, as Hayes genuinely regretted his actions, but also felt that the public reaction had been disproportionate to what he viewed as an honest mistake. Media interest in the case fluctuated during the waiting period, spiking whenever new developments emerged. An investigative journalist from The Guardian published a detailed piece examining the training protocols for plainclothes officers and questioning whether Hayes had received adequate preparation for the types of situations he might encounter. The article raised broader questions about police education and accountability. Marcus used some of his enforced time away from regular duties to reflect on his career path and future goals. He had always planned to serve in the Royal Guard until retirement, but the incident had made him question whether he wanted to continue in a role that might expose him to similar situations. He began exploring options for transferring to administrative positions within the palace organization. The case also sparked renewed interest in police reform among civil rights organizations. Several groups organized peaceful demonstrations calling for better training, increased accountability, and clearer protocols for officer identification. These protests remained small but vocal, keeping the incident in the public consciousness. Hayes attended mandatory counseling sessions as part of his administrative duties while on suspension. The police psychologist helped him understand the cognitive biases and pressure responses that had contributed to his poor decision-making. These sessions were emotionally difficult, but necessary for Hayes to process what had happened and prepare for his hearing. Emma Thornton, whose protection had started the entire sequence of events, found herself reluctantly becoming an advocate for better police training. She gave several interviews explaining how the incident had affected her trust in law enforcement and calling for reforms that would prevent similar situations in the future. Her perspective as the victim whom Marcus had been protecting added weight to calls for change. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled to take place at New Scotland Yard, with a panel consisting of senior police officials and independent civilian oversight representatives. The proceedings would be open to the public and media, ensuring transparency in a case that had attracted significant attention. As the hearing date approached, both Marcus and Hayes prepared for what they knew would be a defining moment in their careers. Marcus worked with palace legal advisors to prepare his testimony, focusing on the facts of what had happened and the impact on his ability to serve effectively. He was determined to present his case professionally and without vindictiveness. Hayes met regularly with his legal team to review the evidence and prepare his defense. They planned to acknowledge his mistakes while arguing that dismissal would be too harsh a penalty for an officer with an otherwise exemplary record. The strategy was risky, as it required Hayes to take responsibility while also appealing for mercy. The weeks leading up to the hearing were marked by intense media speculation about the potential outcomes. Legal experts debated whether Hayes would be dismissed, demoted, or allowed to return to duty with additional training. Public opinion polls showed that most people believed Hayes should face significant consequences, but opinions were divided on whether dismissal was appropriate. Marcus received hundreds of letters of support from members of the public who had been following his case. Many writers shared their own experiences with police misconduct or expressed appreciation for the Royal Guard service to the nation. These messages provided emotional support during a difficult period, but also reminded Marcus of the broader significance of his situation. The palace issued several statements reaffirming its confidence in Marcus, while calling for the police disciplinary process to be conducted fairly and transparently. Senior royal officials understood that the outcome of Hayes's hearing would be closely watched as an indicator of police accountability and institutional integrity. Hayes's family struggled with the ongoing uncertainty and public attention. His wife took a leave of absence from her teaching job to support him through the process, while his children dealt with the social challenges of having a father whose actions had been widely criticized. The family dynamic was strained by the stress and financial pressure of the situation. Professional relationships within both organizations were also affected by the ongoing case. Some of Marcus's colleagues in the Royal Guard expressed frustration with what they saw as insufficient consequences for Hayes, while some police officers felt that Hayes was being unfairly scapegoated for an honest mistake made under pressure. The broader implications of the case continued to reverberate through British society. Academic researchers began studying the incident as an example of institutional conflict and communication failure. Law enforcement training programs incorporated lessons from the case into their curricula, using it as an example of how situations could escalate rapidly when proper procedures were not followed. Community leaders in London organized forums to discuss police-community relations in light of the incident. These meetings provided opportunities for residents to express their concerns and for police officials to explain their procedures and training requirements. The conversations were sometimes heated but generally productive. As the disciplinary hearing approached, Both men found themselves becoming symbols of larger issues in British society. Marcus represented the dignity and service tradition of the Royal Guard, while Hayes embodied questions about police accountability and the consequences of professional mistakes. Neither man had sought this symbolic status, but both understood its importance. The case had evolved far beyond a simple altercation between two individuals. It had become a lens through which British society examined its expectations for public servants, its tolerance for human error, and its commitment to justice and accountability. The hearing would provide answers to some questions, while likely raising new ones about the complex relationships between different branches of public service. Both Marcus and Hayes knew that regardless of the hearing's outcome, their lives had been permanently changed by those few minutes on a rainy London street. The incident had forced them both to confront uncomfortable truths about their professions, their assumptions, and their own fallibility as human beings serving in positions of public trust. The disciplinary hearing began on a cold Monday morning in February, nearly 4 months after the incident that had thrust both Marcus Wellington and Richard Hayes into the public spotlight. The hearing room at New Scotland Yard was packed with reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who had managed to secure seats for what many considered one of the most important police accountability cases in recent years. Chairman of the disciplinary panel, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Elizabeth Morrison, called the proceedings to order at precisely 9 o'clock. The panel included 2 other senior police officials and 2 civilian oversight representatives, creating a balance between professional law enforcement perspective and public accountability. The gravity of the situation was evident in the formal atmosphere and the careful attention to procedural details. Marcus arrived at the building through a side entrance, accompanied by his legal representative and Colonel Hartwell. He wore his dress uniform, a decision that had been carefully considered to demonstrate respect for the proceedings while also emphasizing his status as a fellow public servant rather than a typical civilian complainant. The sight of his Royal Guard insignia served as a powerful reminder of what was at stake in terms of interinstitutional relationships. Hayes entered through the main entrance with his solicitor and police union representative. He appeared composed, but visibly tense, understanding that his 15-year career hung in the balance. The media attention as he walked into the building was intense, with photographers capturing images that would likely accompany whatever verdict the panel reached. The proceedings began with a detailed presentation of the investigation findings. Chief Inspector Thompson methodically walked the panel through the evidence, including witness statements, video footage, and expert analysis of the incident. The presentation took nearly 2 hours and painted a comprehensive picture of how the situation had developed and escalated. The video evidence was particularly powerful when played in the formal setting of the hearing room. The footage, which had been analyzed frame by experts, clearly showed Hayes striking Marcus without adequate provocation or warning. The panel watched intently as the sequence of events unfolded, with particular attention paid to the moments when proper police procedure should have been followed. Marcus was called as the first witness, and his testimony proved to be compelling and measured. He described his background as both a former police officer and current Royal Guard, emphasizing his understanding of law enforcement procedures and his commitment to public service. His account of the incident was detailed and consistent with the evidence, delivered without apparent animosity toward Hayes despite the physical and professional damage he had suffered. Under cross-examination, Marcus maintained his composure and professionalism. Hayes' solicitor attempted to suggest that Marcus had been confrontational or had failed to properly identify himself, but the video evidence and witness statements supported Marcus's version of events. His testimony reinforced the impression of someone who had been genuinely trying to help a member of the public when he was attacked by an officer who had misunderstood the situation. Emma Thornton testified next, providing crucial context about what had been happening before the police officers arrived. Her account clearly established that Marcus had been protecting her from an aggressive drunk man and had behaved professionally throughout their interaction. She described feeling safe and grateful for his intervention, emphasizing that his conduct had been exemplary. The testimony of witnesses who had observed the incident from different angles helped establish a clear timeline and confirmed the basic facts that had emerged during the investigation. Several witnesses expressed shock at seeing what appeared to be an unprovoked attack on someone in Royal Guard uniform, and their accounts reinforced the conclusion that Hayes had acted without proper justification. Detective Sergeant Sarah Mitchell testified about her observations and role in the incident. Her testimony was particularly important because she had been Hayes's partner and could provide insight into his decision-making process. Mitchell acknowledged that the situation had developed rapidly, but also admitted that there had been opportunities to properly assess what was happening before using force. Hayes took the stand on the second day of the hearing, knowing that his testimony would largely determine his fate. His solicitor had prepared him carefully, but everyone understood that his credibility and future depended on how he presented himself and took responsibility for his actions. The courtroom was packed as people waited to hear his account of the incident. Hayes began by acknowledging that he had made serious mistakes and expressing genuine remorse for his actions. He described the stress he had been under during that particular week, the poor visibility conditions, and the rapid escalation of what he had perceived as a threatening situation. His testimony was emotional at times, particularly when he described the impact on his family and his regret over attacking a fellow public servant. Under questioning from the panel, Hayes admitted that he had not followed proper procedures for identifying individuals or assessing the situation before using force. He acknowledged that his assumptions about what was happening had been wrong and that he should have taken more time to understand the circumstances before acting. His admissions were damaging but appeared genuine. The cross-examination by Marcus's legal representative was intense but professional. Hayes was forced to confront the video evidence showing his actions and to explain why he had not recognized obvious signs that Marcus was trying to help rather than harm the woman. His explanations sometimes appeared weak when contrasted with the clear evidence of what had actually occurred. Expert witnesses testified about police training procedures, use of force protocols, and the standards that should apply in situations like the one that had occurred. Their testimony established that Hayes had violated multiple departmental policies and had failed to meet basic professional standards. The experts also discussed the importance of proper identification and assessment procedures in preventing such incidents. The police union representative presented character evidence for Hayes, highlighting his previously exemplary record and the commendations he had received during his career. Colleagues testified about his dedication to duty and his reputation as a fair and professional officer. This testimony was intended to show that the incident was aberrant behavior rather than part of a pattern of misconduct. However, the character evidence was somewhat undermined by testimony about the training Hayes had received and his experience level. With 15 years on the force, including several in plainclothes work, the panel found it difficult to excuse his actions as those of an inexperienced officer making an understandable mistake. The legal arguments presented by both sides reflected the broader tensions surrounding the case. Marcus's representatives argued that Hayes's actions had been inexcusable and that dismissal was necessary to maintain public confidence in police accountability. They emphasized that attacking a royal guard who was helping a citizen represented a serious breach of professional standards that could not be overlooked. Hayes's legal team argued for mercy, emphasizing his remorse, his previously clean record, and the extraordinary circumstances that had contributed to his poor decision-making. They suggested that additional training and a significant suspension would be more appropriate than dismissal, allowing Hayes to learn from his mistakes while preserving his career. The civilian oversight representatives on the panel asked pointed questions about the broader implications of the case. They were particularly interested in what message the panel's decision would send about police accountability and whether the outcome would help or harm public trust in law enforcement. Their questions suggested that they understood the symbolic importance of their decision. During the breaks in testimony, observers noted the stark contrast between the two men at the center of the case. Marcus appeared calm and dignified throughout the proceedings, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the personal cost of revisiting the traumatic incident. Hayes, while respectful and contrite, showed visible signs of the stress and uncertainty he was experiencing. The hearing also revealed the broader impact the incident had had on both men's families and institutions. Testimony from Colonel Hartwell described the effect on Royal Guard morale and the challenges of maintaining public trust when one of their members had been attacked by police. Similarly, senior police officials acknowledged the damage to their institution's reputation and the need for reforms to prevent future incidents. Media coverage of the hearing was extensive, with legal experts and commentators analyzing each day's testimony and speculating about the likely outcome. Public opinion polls continued to show strong support for significant consequences for Hayes, but there was also growing appreciation for the complexity of the situation and the human cost for everyone involved. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, both sides prepared their closing arguments. These would be their final opportunity to influence the panel's decision and to frame the broader meaning of the case. The stakes could not have been higher, with careers, institutional relationships, and public trust all hanging in the balance. The closing day of the hearing would determine not just the fate of Richard Hayes, but also send a powerful message about accountability, professionalism, and the standards expected of those entrusted with public safety. For Marcus Wellington, the outcome would influence whether he could continue his career with confidence or whether the incident would cast a permanent shadow over his service to the Crown. The panel retired to deliberate, knowing that their decision would be scrutinized by the media, analyzed by legal experts, and remembered as a precedent for future cases involving police accountability and interinstitutional conflicts. The wait for their verdict would test the patience and nerves of everyone involved in this complex and emotionally charged case. The disciplinary panel deliberated for 3 days, reflecting the complexity of the case and the weight of their decision. During this time, both Marcus Wellington and Richard Hayes waited in agonizing uncertainty, knowing that the verdict would fundamentally alter the trajectory of their lives and careers. The media speculation was intense, with experts offering conflicting predictions about what the panel might decide. Deputy Assistant Commissioner Elizabeth Morrison called the hearing back to order on Friday morning to announce the panel's findings. The room was even more crowded than during the testimony phases, with additional security personnel present to manage the expected crowd reaction. The atmosphere was electric with tension as everyone waited to hear the verdict that had been 4 months in the making. Morrison's voice was steady and authoritative as she began reading the panel's comprehensive decision. The findings were methodical and detailed, addressing each aspect of Hayes' conduct and the broader implications for police accountability. The panel had clearly taken great care to ensure their reasoning was sound and their decision defensible. The panel found that Detective Inspector Richard Hayes had committed gross misconduct in his treatment of Marcus Wellington. They determined that he had failed to properly assess the situation, had not followed established procedures for identifying individuals, and had used excessive and unjustified force against a fellow public servant who was attempting to assist a member of the public. However, the panel also acknowledged several mitigating factors in their decision. They noted Hayes' previously exemplary service record, his genuine remorse for his actions, and the challenging circumstances that had contributed to his poor judgment. They also considered testimony about his dedication to duty and his reputation among colleagues as a fair and professional officer. The sentence delivered by Morrison was both severe and nuanced. Hayes would be dismissed from the Metropolitan Police, effective immediately, ending his 15-year career in law enforcement. However, the dismissal would be without prejudice, meaning that he could potentially apply for reinstatement after a minimum period of 5 years, subject to retraining and psychological evaluation. Additionally, Hayes was required to issue a formal public apology to Marcus Wellington and to participate in police training programs as a case study, sharing his experience to help other officers avoid similar mistakes. The panel felt that Hayes' participation in training could help prevent future incidents while also demonstrating his commitment to learning from his errors. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and mixed. Supporters of police accountability felt vindicated by the dismissal, but questioned whether 5 years was sufficient for such serious misconduct. Police union representatives were disappointed by the loss of an experienced officer, but acknowledged that the decision could have been harsher. Marcus received the news with quiet satisfaction. While he had hoped for a stronger deterrent effect, he appreciated that Hayes had been held accountable for his actions and that the dismissal sent a clear message about professional standards. The acknowledgement of his own conduct and the vindication of his version of events provided some measure of closure. Hayes was devastated by the loss of his career, but also relieved that the ordeal was finally over. His family had prepared for the possibility of dismissal, but hearing it announced officially was still a crushing blow. However, the possibility of eventual reinstatement provided a glimmer of hope for the future, even as they faced immediate financial and emotional challenges. The public apology ceremony took place 2 weeks after the hearing conclusion, held at a neutral venue to avoid the appearance of favoring either institution. Hayes faced Marcus directly and delivered a heartfelt apology that acknowledged the harm he had caused and accepted full responsibility for his actions. The moment was emotional for both men and provided a form of personal closure beyond the official proceedings. Marcus accepted the apology with grace and dignity, expressing hope that the incident would lead to positive changes in police training and procedures. He emphasized that his goal had never been personal revenge, but rather ensuring accountability and preventing similar incidents from affecting other public servants or citizens. The media coverage of the apology was extensive, with many commentators noting the dignity shown by both men during a difficult process. The image of a dismissed police officer apologizing to a royal guard became symbolic of the broader themes of accountability, forgiveness, and institutional integrity that had emerged from the case. In the months following the hearing, both men began the process of rebuilding their lives and careers. Marcus was reinstated to full duty with the Royal Guard, where he was welcomed back by colleagues who had supported him throughout the ordeal. However, he found that the incident had changed his perspective on public service and his relationship with law enforcement. Marcus eventually transferred to a training role within the Royal Guard, where he could share his experience with new recruits and help them understand the complexities of public service. His story became part of the curriculum, teaching future guards about de-escalation techniques, proper identification procedures, and the importance of maintaining professionalism under pressure. Hayes faced the challenge of starting over at age 42, with a family to support and few transferable skills outside law enforcement. He initially struggled with depression and financial stress, but eventually found work in private security, where his experience and hard-learned lessons about accountability made him a valuable employee. His employer was aware of his history, but appreciated his honesty and commitment to professional standards. The case prompted significant changes within the Metropolitan Police regarding training for plainclothes officers and procedures for situation assessment. New protocols required officers to identify themselves clearly and to take additional time to evaluate circumstances before using force. Hayes' case became a mandatory study topic in police training academies. The Royal Guard also implemented new guidelines for off-duty conduct and interaction with other law enforcement agencies. Marcus's experience highlighted the need for clearer identification procedures and better coordination between different branches of public service. These changes were designed to prevent future misunderstandings while preserving the Guard tradition of public service. Emma Thornton, whose protection had initiated the entire sequence of events, became an advocate for improved police-community relations. She worked with several organizations to promote better training and accountability measures, using her experience to highlight the importance of proper law enforcement procedures. Her advocacy work provided a constructive outlet for her frustration with how the incident had unfolded. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It sparked a national conversation about police accountability, interinstitutional relationships, and the standards expected of public servants. Academic researchers studied the incident as a case example of how organizational culture and training inadequacies could lead to serious professional conflicts. Legislative discussions emerged about strengthening police oversight mechanisms and improving coordination between different law enforcement and security agencies. While no major legislation resulted directly from the case, it contributed to ongoing reform efforts and heightened awareness of accountability issues. 2 years after the incident, both Marcus and Hayes had found stability in their new roles, though neither had forgotten the lessons learned from their brief but consequential encounter. Marcus had become a respected trainer who helped new Royal Guards understand the complexities of modern public service, while Hayes worked diligently in his security role while planning for the possibility of eventual return to police work. The case continued to be cited in legal and academic discussions about police accountability and institutional integrity. Law enforcement experts from other countries studied the British response to the incident, examining how the disciplinary process balanced accountability with recognition of human fallibility and the possibility of redemption. The ripple effects of that rainy November evening continued to influence policy discussions, training programs, and public expectations for law enforcement accountability. What had begun as a misunderstanding between two dedicated public servants had evolved into a catalyst for broader examination of professional standards and institutional relationships. Marcus often reflected on how a simple act of trying to help someone had led to such far-reaching consequences. He remained committed to public service, but with a deeper understanding of its complexities and challenges. The incident had tested his faith in the system, but ultimately reinforced his belief in the importance of accountability and professionalism. Hayes carried the weight of his mistake every day, but channeled his regret into a determination to contribute positively to public safety in whatever capacity he could. The dismissal had ended one career, but had also provided an opportunity for growth and reflection that might not have been possible otherwise. The story of their encounter became more than just a case study in police accountability. It evolved into a narrative about redemption, institutional integrity, and the ongoing struggle to balance human fallibility with the high standards expected of those who serve the public. The lessons learned from their experience continue to influence training, policy, and public discourse long after the headlines had faded and both men had moved forward with their lives. In the end, the incident served as a powerful reminder that even dedicated public servants are human beings capable of both mistakes and growth. The system's response, while not perfect, demonstrated that accountability was possible while still leaving room for redemption and positive change. The legacy of that brief encounter on a London street would continue to influence how British society approached questions of authority, responsibility, and justice for years to come.